good evening, everybody. I'm really honored to open our inauguration ceremony for the academic year 2020-2021. And I'm really sorry that we couldn't do it in person. Professor Mokyr was very happy to come to Turin, but unfortunately, as you know, this was not possible. So it's a bit a contradiction to open up, if you want, to have an inauguration seminar on the web. It's a bit of a pity and a little bit of a contradiction. But anyway, I think we have to use these tools in order to keep connected and to keep working on the flow of ideas. So it's very important that we have this inauguration even in this way. And I have to thank very much Professor Joel Mokyr for having accepted our invitation. I am especially happy to have him because he essentially he has written a lot and he has spoken a lot about the importance of the interaction between technology and science and how this interaction keeps generating increasing returns. And he has taken positions against the idea that essentially this idea of the secular decline, no? The idea that there could be a general slowdown of GDP in the advanced economies simply because essentially science and technology are no longer able to generate the improvements they were generating in the past. And this is a moment in which we really need a lot science and technology, the improvements from science and technology. So I think having him now this year is especially interesting and wonderful for all of us. So thank you, Joel, for being here. Professor Aldo Geuna will later introduce Joel and give your full biography. So I will not say anything more on this. After me, I can see we have Francesco Profumo and of course Stefano Geuna in representation of the University of Turin, the Rector of the University of Turin. Thank you for being with us. Stefano, I think you still have little technical problem, but I'm sure they will be resolved soon. And Francesco Profumo, who is the chairman of the Compagnia di San Paolo. Here you are, Stefano, we can see you well. Thank you very much. And but before starting for the institutional greetings, I wanted to ask you to have a minute of silence in memory of Samuel Paty, who is the professor of history and geography who was beheaded in France last week by a terrorist attack. Our institution, Il Collegio, is really an institution that aims at circulating idea, at the freedom of idea, freedom of thought. So I think that the attack against Professor Paty was really something against this idea of freedom of thought and freedom of thinking. So I will ask you to have a minute of silence in memory of Professor Paty, and then we can start our work, if you don't mind. So 1 minute from now, please. Okay, this is 1 minute. Thank you very much for doing this. Now, Francesco, Stefano is the rector is connected. We don't see him, but we can hear you. So
yes, I think you can hear me, but there is no way for connecting the video. So
okay, so
I think you hear me very well. I hear you very well.
We hear you very well. Would you like to start with the greetings and then we move to Francesco?
Thank you very much. So thank you very much to everyone, especially to our special guest. It's a big honor to have you here for your lecture. And so it's, of course, I came to know the Collegio Carlo Alberto only a few months ago when I started my work as rector of the university, as I'm from another scientific field, the medical field. But since the beginning, we started to work together, of course, with Compagnia di San Paolo and its president, Francesco Profumo, and with Giorgio Barba. And I appreciate since the beginning the very innovative profile and work of this institution that is really representing an excellence in our local landscape, but also with a very strong projection at the national and international level. So it's a big pleasure to give this introductory talk to the ceremony of the beginning of the academic year of Collegio Carlo Alberto, and the project are to have an even stronger and more respectful and prestigious institution for the next future. We have many projects. The idea is that today the Collegio is moving from a more narrow economical institution to a more broad institution that looks to the different fields of science, of course, related to economy, but also sociology and legal issues. But today we know that with the issues related to the circular economy and the sustainability, we know that somehow all the different disciplines are together in a single approach that is very important for the progress of science. So thank you very much. Welcome and good beginning of the academic year to everyone, especially to the fellows and the students and all the people of the Collegio Carlo Alberto.
Thank you very much, Stefano. The support of with the university, the interaction with the university is really very important for us, as you know. So it's a great pleasure and honor to be able to work with you, and I'm very happy you could greet us at the opening of this ceremony. Francesco Profumo, who is the president of the Compagnia di San Paolo, who is our other main partner of the Collegio Carlo Alberto, and also the main sponsor of the Collegio Carlo Alberto. Francesco.
Thank you, Giorgio. This is my fifth ceremony of the opening of the academic year of Collegio Carlo Alberto in my capacity as president of Compagnia di San Paolo. This is for me, it's a great honor, and at the same time, it's also really a good way to start the academic year of all the institutions in Torino. I'm very pleased to know that Professor Mokyr is a professor that is interested in economics and technology. And as you know, Torino is a special city from this point of view. It's really a technological city, but in the meantime, we have a great institution from the economic point of view. And for sure, the Collegio Carlo Alberto is one of the open bridge related to the world for this field. Then I'm very pleased as the president of the Compagnia to say that this academic year is the really opening of the new strategic plan of the Collegio Carlo Alberto. I know that you did an excellent job in the last months, and I'm pleased that you start this new academic year starting with this topic. I'm sure that tonight we will have a good number of participants. Unfortunately, we cannot be in the beautiful hall that you have there. I'm reading that right now we have 139 participants. That's quite a lot. Then I want to say that we are changing very rapidly our way to approach the different events. Maybe 1 year ago, maybe more, was almost impossible to have the opening of the academic year of the Collegio Carlo Alberto using this remote way. But today, this is happening. And I want to say, first of all, that I'm very pleased for this. And in the meantime, I really wanted to give you my best greetings in order to have an excellent year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Also, thank you very much for your introduction. As I said before, for the university, it's also fundamental, the interaction we have with you and with the institution you represent, and the support the Compagnia keeps constantly giving to Il Collegio is really very, very important to us. I'm also pleased, as you said, that we can have this opening at least on the web. It would have been impossible probably a few years ago. Having said that, I think that human interaction cannot keep being mediated by a screen or by a microphone. And I really hope that we will go back to seeing each other in presence and interacting in presence. Human beings are made to interact directly. Whatever technologies makes them more connected, I think. Actually, I must say that we had today another technological failure, because I was supposed to have a nice fake background screen behind my back, and we couldn't put it. So I just put 2 books on my shelves of Professor Mokyr, and which is his very important book, The Gifts of Athena. And so you can see there, Joel, in your honor. That's the only thing I could do. And it's nice because we went back to the real thing. So, you know, so sometimes it's nice to be able to move from technology to the real thing. Let me say a few words about Il Collegio before I give the floor to Aldo Geuna, who will introduce Joel Mokyr. I think Il Collegio, and I want to take a couple of definitions from the world of technology. I think the Collegio is at the same time a nursery and an accelerator of interdisciplinary research. As you know, at Il Collegio, we have economists, we have scholars of law, we have political scientists, sociologists, and statistics. So it's really a nice cradle of people working in many different disciplines and interacting together. And I think we had a good example of this during the COVID crisis, where essentially we asked our faculty, which is actually composed of 19 internal members of the faculty, people who really work at Il Collegio, part of them which are joined with the University of Turin, and then we have 39 fellows and affiliates who are professors or have academics of the University of Turin, which are also part of Il Collegio. Essentially, we asked our faculty to try to think if they had something in mind they could say about COVID. And there was a very, very strong reaction. More than 20 projects were presented that the Collegio gave mini grants to start developing these new research projects. It was an extraordinary response, and it was interesting because most of the papers were also made by people from different disciplines. So it's interesting how this happened. But anyway, we are, even though we have done this, we are an academic institution. So most of the research occurs bottom up. And I must say, I'm very pleased to say that besides for these projects I was mentioning, the researchers of Il Collegio are doing a fantastic jobs. This last year, we had publications in the top journal in all the disciplines that are represented at Il Collegio. For economics, the Review of Economic Studies. For finance, the Review of Financial Studies and the Journal of Financial Economics. For politics, the American Political Science Review. These are very important achievements for Il Collegio that can have to work at the same time at the top of the academic, if you want, an academic research, bottom-up academic research, but at the same time being able to work on the interdisciplinarity of Il Collegio to boost research projects that sometimes are more focused. And this is very important. In doing this, what is really crucial for us is our faculty. As I said, we have 19 internal members of the faculty. We managed to integrate our faculty in the University of Torino. Many of our faculty members managed to win competition in the University of Torino and now have joint position between the Collegio and the University of Torino. And I would say that the main goal of Il Collegio is really to attract brains in Torino, at the University of Torino, that they can interact with the faculty who is already resident at the University of Turin. We have, the Collegio, we have a very, very open and international community. The faculty is hired on the international market. 50% of our faculty are foreign nationals. If you come to our seminars, it's always, most of the speakers used to come from abroad. Now they speak from abroad, but at least certainly it's very international. And this is very important for us and for Italy. I keep giving one figure, which is this number, which for me, it's terrible. The number is 2. 2 is the share between the number of Italian scholars that have won this year the ERC, which is the European Research Council grants, which is the most important grants for research. And it's the ratio between the number of scholars and the number of Italian institutions that won them. Not because each institution had at least 2 scholars, had 2 scholars on average winning it, but simply because most of the Italian researchers are outside of Italy, and the Italian institutions have trouble in winning the ERC. So if we want to be at the head of social science, we have to build institutions that are really able to win these competitions. And I think that Il Collegio really aims at doing this and tries to doing this. And I think that this is very important. So attracting brains is really one of the key goals of our Collegio. Naturally, Il Collegio is also an institution for education. We have, and today, essentially, by opening the academic year, in fact, if we are opening Il Collegio also to our students, we have been able, up to now, to keep Il Collegio open so that the students could come to the Collegio. We have facilities and rooms and classrooms which are large enough to accommodate our students and to have face-to-face classes, and this has been very important for us. I hope we will be able to keep doing this. I'm not sure given the trend in the virus, but I think that this is important. We can do this as much as we can. Joel, probably you don't know, we have this program which we are very proud, which is called the Allievi program. The Allievi program is a program that essentially gives extra courses, mostly in quantitative methods, to the most talented students of Il Collegio, of the University of Turin and of the Politecnico, which is the engineering school of Turin. Now, the interesting thing is that usually these courses were mostly for economists. Now we have opened them up, a series of courses also for other social scientists, and this has been quite successful, and we are very happy that we can essentially work on the idea that we can share methods across different disciplines, methodologies across different disciplines. And that is really very much, and the students we have are extremely talented. They manage to, if they do an academic career, they get placement in top graduate programs in the US and in many other places. We have also one in Northwestern, which is good. And so we think this is a very important program. Then we have a series of other master courses. This year we started a very important new master, which is managed by Elisa Luciano, our colleague Elisa Luciano, who is a master in insurance innovations with sponsorship from the real world, I would say, besides for the Compagnia di San Paolo, from Banca Intesa and Reale Assicurazioni. And the idea is really to start working on how the new technologies can affect the insurance market. So we're really working at the frontier on this. Besides for this teaching, of course, we have a lot of outreach activities, and essentially we really try to spread out ideas and research-grounded ideas and research-grounded issues on real-world issues we try to discuss, and have a lot of activities in the dissemination of ideas. And I would say that the lecture of today is also partly a lecture of disseminations of the great ideas and thought of Joel Mokyr. Let me conclude by saying 2 things. The first one, that of course this has been a pretty difficult year up to now because of the closing. We have tried to do as much as we can online, and I think we have been quite successful in doing this. and also that we will see how this year will evolve, but we will keep coming up to our public and to all our stakeholders, either through the web or directly if we will be able to do it. All what the Collegio does wouldn't be doable without all the people that work for Il Collegio. I must say, certainly our board of directors, which is doing a wonderful job. And I want to mention the two vice presidents of Il Collegio, who are Oriana Bandiera and Olivier Boin. We have a new advisory board, which is chaired by Domenico Siniscalco, who essentially will help us connecting the Collegio to the real world and also in the activities of fundraising. The faculty is organized under the wonderful supervision of Dino Gerardi, who is our dean, who is doing a wonderful job within a faculty council with 3 vice deans, each of them representing a discipline: Michele Graziadei for legal studies, Diego Gambetta for sociology and politics, and Giovanni Mastrobuoni for economics. And finally, I want to thank our new managing director, Paolo Campolonghi, who's doing a wonderful job, and he immediately entered into the shoes, I would say, of Il Collegio, and he's doing a wonderful job. And all the fantastic staff of Il Collegio that has been working, I would say, twice than what they normally do in this period, very difficult periods, and they kept the machine going. And so I'm really very grateful to all of them for the fantastic job they have done. Now, I have spoken enough. I told Joel that once we would have finished all these introductions, he would be left with 2 minutes for his lecture. I would like to avoid this. And so I stop here. I thank you, everybody, and I give the floor to Aldo. Aldo, thank you very much for accepting to introduce Joel.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. It's a pleasure and honor for me to do this very brief, given that it's half an hour that we are here, introduction to Joel. But I don't think that Professor Mokyr needs to be introduced, but still let me do the formal introduction. Professor Mokyr is a professor, Robert Stroll's Professor of Arts and Science and Professor of Economics and History at Northwestern University. He's among a handful of top economic historians. He has contributed to economics of technological change and economics of population change. I don't want to spend time listing all his activities, but let me just briefly remind that he won very prestigious prizes like the Heineken Prize by the Royal Dutch Academy, and most recently the Balsan Prize. He is fellow, among others, of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, fellow of the Royal Dutch Academy, fellow dell'Accademia Nazionale dei Lincei, fellow of the British Academy, and so on and so forth. I don't want to continue to list all the fellowship. This just to say Mokyr, Professor Mokyr is a super well-known academic in the US and in Europe. As I said, his main field, his main contribution is economic history, but taken in a very broad perspective. And let me spend the next 2 minutes to tell you something about when I discovered the work of Joel Mokyr. Actually, I was a young PhD student, and someone, a colleague of mine, gave me this book, strange book. I actually still have it here, The Lever of Riches. And I said, what the hell is this book about? And then I start reading it slowly. I have to admit that I do have some interest in history, and I really enjoyed it a lot. This book provides a fascinating account of the role of technological progress in modern economic growth, and starts from back to the past and takes us to the Industrial Revolution and tries to explain, put forward, understand the role of technological progress in Industrial Revolution. But what, if I have to say, I always say to my students, at least learn one thing. The most important thing that I learned from that book is this multi-causal framework. Joel was very, very clear in explaining how complex is reality, understanding the role of technological change and understanding how technological change has contributed to industrial revolution and how industrial revolution has contributed to industrial growth and economic growth more in general is actually the big question addressed by economic history since a lot of years. And I think Joel has given a wonderful explanation. Back then, I was a young Schumpeterian student. I was studying evolutionary theory, and then I said, wow, this is a wonderful application of evolution theorizing. There is a special last chapter in which there is this attempt of bridge together historical thinking, historical analysis to a broader perspective on economic growth. Joel has continued working on this path for the next 20 years. And actually, this multi-causal approach has pushed him to try to find the reasons for technological change in Europe, in the UK first, but then more in general in continental Europe or in Europe. And he tried to answer to the deep question, why Europe? Why not China? Why not India? Actually, the history of technology pinpoints a lot of innovation in those countries. But then the major transformation of single important innovation in a phenomenon called technological change, and then the contribution to this, to industrial revolution, happened in Europe. And so in his most recent books, From the Gift to Athena to the most recent A Culture of Growth, is really taken and sliced a bit of a pie in each book. And fundamentally, in the most recent one, is put forward two reasons behind the development of technological change and the connection between technological change and industrialization. One is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment as a phenomena, a characteristical, a specific, a peculiar phenomena of Europe. Some other scholar is speaking of scientific revolution. I don't want to enter here in the debate on, but in general, this period, these 200 years that are before the flourishing and the industrial revolution, known as Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, and then the contribution on competition. At the end, is an economist, an economic historian, but economist, and then makes a very nice argument that I think will be also part of the discussion in and around this idea of competition between countries. There were different countries in Europe with different rulers, and there was a competition for prestige on one side in science and technology and in industry, and on the other side, if you were not lucky in one country, then you can try to find your luck in another country. And that has been a traditional characteristics of Europe. Actually, from medieval Europe onward, we see scholars that are walking around. If they have one problem in one country, they move to another country and then they progress in their own career. So I really think that is the characteristics, the deep characteristic of Europe. And Joel has made the point very well and has argued very well around this point, and has definitely contributed to our understanding of a fascinating and very complex phenomena. As Giorgio started this presentation, Joel is not among the supporter of the view that we are in a downturn of, let's say, creativity in science and technology, and is connected to productivity, to economic growth, and opens the discussion to the future. So knowing better what has happened in the last 400 years may, I think, will help us to understand better what is happening now and what maybe we are doing wrong now, because in reality, the last 30 or 40 years have been years of low productivity growth compared to the 50, 60 years before. And so thanks a lot to Joel for being here and for sharing with us in this inaugural lecture on Attitudes and Aptitudes. That it was very tricky for me to pronounce in English. Fundamentally, it's the same sound for an Italian. In Italian, they mean, I actually checked on the dictionary, atteggiamenti e attitudini, that in Italian are two very different sounds, and in English, as in Italian, are two different concepts. And I think it's going to build around these two concepts to speak about European culture as as a very specific characterizing factor behind the technological change, behind scientific revolution, behind industrialization. Again, Joel, thank you very much for coming online, at least. We look forward to have you here in reality and for sharing with us your thoughts about the contribution of technology science to economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Aldo. Thank you very much. Joel, the floor is yours. Maybe if someone wants to ask some question, you know, there is a question and answer little frame thing in your Zoom. So if you want to ask questions, then at the end of your lecture, Joel, I can convey those to you. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. This will be a lecture about history. I will not have to say very much about the matters of the day. I will not say anything about the pandemic or about a certain orange-haired politician in the United States whose name I can't recall right now. But I do want to start with something that is relevant to what's happening. I want to ask a very naive question, and that is, we're talking about a little bit about the sort of current wave of protests against racial injustice and discrimination, the Black Lives Matter movement. So here's a really naive question that only an economist would raise, and that is, why really isn't it ever the other way around? I mean, we look at history and we know, whites had black slaves. We know there's very few examples of black people having white slaves. We didn't see African and Asian colonial empires exploiting Europeans. And, the standard tale that historians tell is that over the last 400 years, Europeans have dominated and subjugated and enslaved and exploited much of the rest of humanity in multiple ways, and that the remnants of this asymmetrical relation are still at the foundation of today's race relation. And this isn't just true about the United States. It's true elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere. For instance, you look at Brazil, you look at the Afro-Brazilians or Afro-Caribbeans, but even in Europe, where black slavery was really never introduced on a large scale, we do observe the same thing in places like France and the UK, where people of African and Asian descent are discriminated against and disadvantaged by white people, all the way from mortgage lenders to employers to police brutality and all that. And, I want to stress that this is racism, but it isn't just racism, okay? There's obviously a relation. Racism, as I understand it, is basically means that you dislike others who don't look or sound like you. But what we're looking at is racism coupled to inequality, and this kind of inequality or asymmetry, if you want. Now, they're related, obviously, because racism usually means inequality, but at least formally they're not the same, and you can have one without the other. But then the question is why? What's the source of this inequality? And I should like to submit to you that there is nothing inherent in whiteness or in certain European cultural features such as Christianity, or for that matter, European geography, that would explain it. Of course, much less bogus theories based on race or genetics or biology. And the evidence for that, for me, the smoking gun, is that it hasn't always been so. I mean, if you go back to the year 1000, okay, white Christian Europe was an ignorant, impoverished, violent backwater, whereas both the worlds of Islam and the worlds of Chinese under the Song dynasty, at roughly speaking that time, were sophisticated and literate society that made major advances of medicine, mathematics, engineering, philosophy, literature, on and on. And so people in history speak about the Great Divergence in which Europe and China went different ways, but we really should call this the Great Reversal, because once upon a time China was way ahead, and of course at a later point they were not. And so since it's clearly not biology or geography, it must be something about history. And somehow, at some point, white people, that is to say Europeans, acquired a mysterious advantage over brown and black people that allowed this inequality to emerge. So it created early colonialism, And then later, modern imperialism, and of course, the gaps between the incomes of white as opposed to non-white people, both within economies and, of course, between economies. And so one of the great ironies of history, and I only mentioned this, by the way, is that Europeans for a long time were able to colonize and enslave and exploit people elsewhere in the world. But the descendants of these subjugated people today are far richer than their ancestors, thanks in large part to European knowledge. And so the historical watershed has been dubbed by my friend Deirdre McCloskey to the Great Enrichment, which really stresses the fact that it has been a worldwide rise in living standards. It hasn't just been in Europe. That said, the racial divides are still there as these persistent legacies of the Great Reversal. And so if you had to sum up the origins of the Great Divergence or the Great Reversal or the Great Enrichment, any of these greats, if you had to sum them up in one word, one single word, what would it be? And the answer is, in my view, is knowledge. And again, there's no European advantage here, many centuries ago. Even if you go back, say, to 1250, which is sort of the beginning of the Renaissance, other civilizations at that time were far more advanced in science and technology, had better educational infrastructure, higher literacy, more sophisticated state capacity and governance, certainly more human capital as we normally define it, and on and on and on. But by the 18th century, say, around 1750, at the onset of the Industrial Revolution, this gap between Europe and the rest of the world is already there. And here is a quote of Dr. Johnson, the Dr. Johnson, who has this fictional story about an Abyssinian prince called Rasselas. And Rasselas asked the philosopher friend, this is 1759, so just on the eve of the Industrial Revolution. And he says, by what means, he says, are the Europeans so powerful? Why? Since they can so easily visit Asia and Africa for trade or conquest, cannot the Asiatics and Africans invade their coasts, plant colonies in their ports? After all, the same winds that carry the Europeans back would bring us thither. And the answer that was provided by the philosopher is, they are more powerful than we, sir, because they are wiser. Knowledge will always predominate over ignorance. But why their knowledge is more than ours, I know not. I added that emphasis because that's, of course, the answer, the question that I want to answer. So before I move on, I have just a very brief digression so we exactly agree what we're talking about, okay? It isn't actually obvious what it means for a society to know something. I mean, we know what an individual knows something, but what does it mean for a society to know something? And my definition is that social knowledge is defined as the union of the sets of knowledge of all members of society. So even if one person knows it, it's already known to that society. And then the question, of course, is, does knowledge matter? Can it be effective? That is to say, can it change people's behavior in one form or another? So, the effectiveness of knowledge depends on lots of things, and I'm not going to list them all here, but at least there are three factors that you may just want to keep in the back of your head. One is a density, that is to say, what proportion actually know a relevant piece of knowledge. So if it's one person or, lots of people, that will make a difference. Secondly, access. That is to say, how costly is it for somebody who does not possess the knowledge to acquire it? Okay, so go to the library or hire a consultant or, some way we can acquire the knowledge. And finally, what I call tightness. That is to say, you know something, but do you really believe that it's true? And do you trust the authorities who tell them that it is true? These are big issues, and I'm not going to be able to get into them, but just keep this at the background, okay? So then the question is, did Europeans know more? And, since there's no obvious metric by which you can actually measure the quantity of knowledge, I'm not sure I can ever answer that. But what matters probably is what kind of knowledge emerged, and what were the questions that intellectuals were interested in, and how much of an impact did they have on the worlds of technology and production. So either way, then I'm now getting to the main subject of the talk, and that is the answer to Prince Rasselas's question can be summarized by two words: attitudes and aptitudes. And these, of course, were the result of changes that occur in Europe in the 3 centuries before Dr. Johnson wrote these words. So roughly speaking, say between the invention of the printing press in 1450 to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, traditionally dated in the middle of the 18th century. Okay. And so in those 3 centuries, the factors that affected the accumulation and dissemination of knowledge changed. And the main take-home point, and this is the one slide that really matters here, I think, is that during the centuries that we call early modern Europe, Europeans developed those attitudes and aptitude that drove them to acquire the kind of knowledge that gave them advantage in certain capabilities that resulted in white domination. And that entailed things like slavery, colonialism, and at least for a long time, a huge economic gap in income per capita and living standards between Europe and the rest of the world. So these are, as I said, two parts of the argument: attitudes and aptitudes. And let me start with attitudes. So it's hard to believe that the growth in useful knowledge that happened in those centuries was independent of epistemological beliefs and preferences and value. That is to say, what we call more generally culture. And between 1450 and 1700, I will argue, there were improvements taking place in European cultural environments in which the idea of progress and the willingness to challenge and control nature to improve the human condition became part of the dominant culture. And I want to single out, I'm not going to be able to cover the whole thing because I wrote a big, long book about that, and it would take way too much time to cover it. But I want to single out 3 components of those attitudes, which in my view are very important. And I've been believing this now for many years. In fact, the first time I mentioned those is in the book that Aldo mentioned, which is The Lever of Riches. But I think it's actually something that's worth repeating and reflecting on. And the first point I want to make is skepticism. And that is, by 1450, by the beginning of our period, Europeans had rediscovered much of the learning of ancient Greece and Rome, at least those parts that survived in books. And they realized, of course, that there was a lot of wisdom and a lot of learning there. But then they also realized there was a lot of error and a lot of things that just weren't so. And so if you look at the previous century, so what we call the medieval European intellectuals, with some exceptions, I should say, they really believed that the world of the great philosophers and scientists whom they didn't know all of them, but the ones that they knew, like Aristotle and Ptolemy and Plinius and Galenus, this was the truth. These words were sacrosanct. And by about 1500, people start to criticize them. And I would say over the next 2 centuries, by 1700, basically a whole bunch of names that we all learn about in high school, and many others that we don't, have created a new science. And basically, at times, they were dismissing the classical canon, the classical wisdom, with some disrespect, some contempt. Okay, but it could be really border on this. I'll give you a few examples just to give you sort of the flavor of this. So, as late as the late 15th century, in 1509, a man called Niccolo Leoniceno, who was a professor at Ferrara, published a book called De Erroribus Plini. That speaks for itself, the mistakes of Plinius, okay? And, 50 years later, the PhD thesis of a French philosopher, Pierre de la Ramée, or Petrus Ramus, as he was known, here are his dates, and he wrote his dissertation on the errors of Aristotle. And you go a little bit further on, and you see people really being impolite. I mean, Francis Bacon writes in the beginning of the 17th century, the Greek writers of science certainly do have a characteristic of the child, the readiness to talk with the inability to produce anything, for their wisdom seems wordy and barren of words. And then, they go to somebody like William Gilbert in the Magnete, which is about the same time, very influential, much admired books about magnets and electricity. And he said, I'm not going to waste my time quoting the ancients and the Greeks because they don't really know anything. I'm not going to read the whole quote to you, but you get the flavor. I mean, this is really going quite an extreme. And so I argue, that without skepticism, there would be no progress, and that sacred cows were slaughtered left, right, and center. And knowledge was, and this is, I think, a word that describes it, right? It was contestable. Everything had to be examined and tested. So the slogan of the Royal Society, which was founded in 1660 in London, is in nullius verba, which means on no one's word. Don't take anybody's word for it, okay? And, by the mid-17th century, even the Holy Bible itself, the most sacred text, did not escape dispassionate textual analysis from such heterodox intellectuals, some of them very well known, Spinoza, Hobbes. Even so, of course, the clerics of the time were, fiercely indignant about that, Of course, you go into the 18th century, it gets worse, you look at people like, Diderot, it's the man who questioned everything. And this is not atypical of the kind of culture that we see in Europe. And so, of course, there's a struggle there. The traditionalists resisted. There is what the French call an querelle des anciens et des modernes, a struggle between the ancients and the moderns. But what I think the historiography of that basically tells you is that the moderns won this thing hands down. By the late 17th century, the writings of, people like Galileo, Huygens, and finally, of course, Newton and all their followers and all their epigoni basically hammered the last nails in the coffin of the ancient physical science and the astronomy. And in astronomy, of course, by 1700, the Copernican universe is widely accepted. And it really goes beyond physics, you look at somebody like William Harvey in medicine, showing that the Galenic model of blood circulation is completely wrong. And then, a little bit later, Francesco Redi, a Florentine doctor, basically shows that Aristotle's belief in spontaneous generation of plants and insects was wrong. And so we can make this list infinitely long, but they examined the knowledge, and when they found it wrong, they say it's wrong. And I want to emphasize that this is actually very unusual in the world. If you look at other civilizations, China, Islam, India, basically you see these struggles if you look carefully enough, but basically most of the time the traditionalists won the day. The same is even true for Jewish civilization. And the Jewish were intellectuals, they had a lot of human capital, but the idea that you could question the canon, the Bible, the Mishnah, the Talmud, it was unthinkable. The only guy who ever did that was Spinoza, and they kicked him out. He was essentially ostracized by the Jewish community. And so in almost all of those civilizations, I would say the iron grip of the tenacious past and what we perhaps might best call intellectual ancestor worship. And that's blocking intellectual innovation, okay? And so instead, these people know things, but their knowledge consists of exegesis and philology. And basically, if you wanted to know, you want to engage in intellectual debates, you don't question the ancient sages. You just try to figure out what they really meant. Now, that could still lead to some disputes. The Talmud is full of these disputes. But in the end, you are constrained by the framework of what these people wrote. So, that phenomenon, I think, is really quite clear once you look for it. Explaining it is harder. I would say at least couple of factors maybe played a role here. One is that there is in general less ancestor worship in Europe, maybe in large part because they lived in smaller nuclear families and not in clans. And perhaps the thing that Aldo already mentioned, that the polycentric nature of European politics made it the suppression of heretics harder because it's a coordination failure. Everybody had to suppress the same heretics at the same time, and most of the conservative forces, were fighting one another as much as they were fighting the forces of progress. So it's also probably true that the great voyages, say starting around 1492, made a lot of people realize that the world wasn't quite what the Greeks had described. And then, of course, new instruments come online, the telescope, the microscope, things like that allow them to see things that the classics could not see because they didn't have these instruments. And so they can tell, hey, we know more than these guys because we have better tools and instruments. And to some extent, that's still actually going on. All right. Second element in those changes in attitudes, and that's what I call openness. So Europe, from very early times, and this started long before the Renaissance, okay, Europeans were willing to learn from other civilization and readily adopted their ideas or stole them, depending on how you look at it. And once they do that, they often go on to improve upon that. Okay? And so when they start traveling around the world in 1500, they adopted and then learn how to make a whole bunch of things that were not indigenous to Europe, all the way from Indian cottons, Chinese silks and porcelain, to many crops from the Western hemispheres, like maize and potatoes, and we all know these things that they adopted. And it's quite clear that they were explicitly trying to learn and then copy and adopt these new forms of technology and medicine. So this is sometimes known as the Colombian Exchange, and many other people have written about it. And this is what Europeans did. They did this in addition to, forcibly, of course, trying to convert people to the true religion, which was, in their views, Christianity. They stole their gold and silver, they stole their lands, they enslaved them if they could, in order to grow crops that the Europeans desired. Okay, but they also learned from them, and the two things are clearly related. Now, this, as I said, actually starts earlier than the Renaissance, although it comes, of course, to its full fore only by 1500. This is the appreciation that you see in the Middle Ages. European happily adopted things that they got from the Islamic world, like windmills and papers, and of course the decimal system. And the medical authorities that people studied in medical school, had names like Rhazes and Avicenna, which of course is Al-Razi and Ibn Sina. They knew this very well, and they knew that they were Muslims, and that didn't seem to bother them, of course. The influence that Ibn Rushd or Averroes had on Western philosophy was probably much larger than it was he had in the Islamic world. His work was, of course, deeply influential on people like Thomas Aquinas. And then you go outside philosophy, you go into astronomy and optics, you look at people like Alhazen and so on and so forth. Many of the words that we use basically tell you that these were taken from other civilizations, and the Europeans weren't at all embarrassed about that, So we have used alcohol, which comes from Arabic, or algebra. We still call these things Arabic numerals. European were wearing damasks from Damascus and calicoes from the city of Calico, and on and on and on and on and on and on. What is striking is that this movement is mostly one way. I don't want to say entirely because it isn't, but it's mostly one way. After 1200, there is very little in Western culture that Islam wants to adopt before the 19th century, unless it's something highly specific, like weapons. But key inventions, especially printing, were resisted by Islamic society for many centuries. And the same is true, mutatis mutandis, for China and Japan after 1600 or so. And that, I think, is very much part of the story. David Landis once wrote a wonderful sentence. He says, good imitators make good innovators. And a good example of this is cotton. So Cotton grows nowhere in Europe. It has to be entirely important. Okay, so Europeans imported cotton cloth from the Middle East and then India. But then they realized that they could import the raw cotton and then the spinning and the weaving and the carding and the bleaching and the printing all by themselves. And they got good at it. They got so good at it that they got far better than anybody else. That is, in fact, part of the Industrial Revolution. And a recent author, Barbara Hahn, wrote a very nice book about it. And she says, European fabric producers competed with Asian specialty textiles until the substitute obliterated the industry it was designed to imitate. And I think that is a very good example of things that Europeans could do. And so this openness, I find this openness really striking. I mean, Europeans are just as bigoted and prejudiced and racist as anybody else, maybe more so. But that did not preclude their willingness to adopt foreign ideas. Here's just one example that I ran into. And in 1613, okay, Laden University, I like this university because I was born in Leiden, established one of Europe's very first chairs of Arabic language. And its culture was a man called Thomas van Erpe, or Thomas Erpenius in the Latinized version. These are his dates. And in his inaugural lecture, he laid out the rationale. He says, Arab culture has a world of wisdom to teach. And that is an attitude that makes a difference. So again, the explanation of that is to some extent is competition. Europe is heavily fragmented, so everybody realizes that you have to run to stay in place lest others get ahead of you. And so this fragmentation, by the way, is not just political, it's across religions, it's across states, it's across cities, universities. Now everybody is competing with everybody else, and so that clearly means you take the knowledge where you can get it. There are other reasons, but I'm going to leave those aside right now. The third and last of these attitudes is what I call neophilia. And that is European elites developed a taste for things that were new and unfamiliar, and they rewarded what I call intellectual innovators. So people who came up with new ideas in the arts, in music, in the sciences, in occult, all kind of areas, were rewarded and enjoyed high status. Of course, nobody did better than Isaac Newton, who became something of a national hero. But many other people, of course, were hugely respected and got very nice, cushy jobs in various academies and royal societies. In fact, many of these leading scientists became celebrities, and they landed these posh and comfortable patronage positions. Now they were supposed to give something in return, and so many of their patrons, you hired them as doctors or asked them to help with navigation, with ballistics, engineering, astrology, very important, and on and on and on. So they have this sort of mutually beneficial relationship between people in power with resources and people who knew things. And I would say this is a good example of the blessings of a well-functioning and competitive market. On the one hand, intellectuals competing with each other for patronage and jobs, and so they're trying to outdo each other and produce new ideas. And on the other hand, on the demand side, courts and universities and academies wanted the most famous and illustrious scholars to signal their greatness. And then, but as I said, also expected these people to render certain services. Now, how do you know who the best scholars are? And the answer is, of course, to a great extent, is that it's reputation among peers. And to acquire such a reputation, you had to be innovative. And this is what we still do. I mean, the academic world works on reputation mechanisms, and reputation is determined by what your peers think of your work and say about you. And so between 1500 and 1750, a lot of radical new ideas are proposed between a European intellectual scene. Some of them are developed by Europeans, some were adopted from elsewhere, and some of them were, borrowed and stolen and so on. Now, I hasten to add that not all of these new ideas were good. In fact, probably, it says many of them were bogus. I would probably say most of them were bogus. You know, there's a lot of nonsense being written, just fake news and pseudoscience were at least as common then as they are now. Astrology and numerology and occult and, you know, black magic, all these things were very popular. And yet, if you look behind that, it is quite clear there's progress toward ideas that worked. And surprisingly, wherever possible, knowledge that worked was put to good use, far more than anywhere else. So here is one example that I'm very fond of, that this will give you this idea. So on the left picture, you see somebody you probably all learned about in high school in Italy. This is Evangelista Torricelli, inventor of the barometer and the discoverer of an atmosphere. Now that leads to what's known as the vacuum pump, and that you can see this Boyle 1660 creates a vacuum pump. And then the realization is that the differences in pressure between a cylinder where there is a vacuum and the actual atmosphere can actually make a piston go up or down. So the first realization of that is Denis Papin. So this is a set of models that he built between 1690 and 1707. And on the right, you actually see the full realization of this, which is a Newcomen steam engine, the very first working steam engine that we see in the Western world. And of course, the rest is history, so to speak. Now, I could come up with endless examples like that in many areas, but this is perhaps the best known one. So again, what explains this European neophilia? And, you know, it's obvious that every society has some people who think outside the box, who come up with novel ideas. What differs between different societies are the incentives and the risks. Now, everywhere, including Europe, being innovative and iconoclastic carries some risk of being accused of heresy and apostasy, blasphemy, witchcraft, black magic, all those things, okay? And of course, early modern Europe persecuted many innovators and executed a few. The most famous, of course, is the public burning of Giordano Bruno in 1600 in Rome. But you know, it happened to a few others. Not a lot, I should say. But as I said, to be successful on a continent-wide scale, these reactionary policies required coordination by the entities that enforced them. And lacking that, these intellectual innovators could play competing powers against one another and move between different political entities, and many did. And, you know, Aldo already referred to that, but I want to give you just one example, one of my favorite heretics. This is Tomasso Campanella. Here are his dates. So he was a monk, but you can see he's a monk, but he was a professional troublemaker, I should say, is probably his best definition, but a very, very bright man. And so he was accused of heresy and he was sentenced to life imprisonment, spent 27 years in a Neapolitan jail. But just because he had good political connections and because he was under the protection of the Emperor Rudolf, who liked him, he actually used his time in jail to write 7 books, including a pamphlet defending Galileo. So, I mean, it can't have been all that terrible. And when he was finally let out, he went to France and he spent some time at the court of Louis XIII. Clearly, he was brilliant at playing the Habsburg against the Austrian Habsburg against the Spanish Habsburgs, and them against the Bourbon and French. And that, I think, is a classic example. Here's one more, but I won't say much about him. But this is Comenius, a Czech, actually born in Moravia, and he escaped religious and intellectual intolerance over and over and over again. So he moved from Moravia to Poland, to England, to Sweden, to Hungary, died in Amsterdam, and he was even offered in 1636 the presidency of Harvard University, which he very wisely declined. But obviously he played he played these European powers against each other, and a real, and not necessarily obviously important to technology, but an intellectual innovator of major proportions. Okay, and so what happens in Europe in the 17th and even more in the 18th century? is that the persecution of these deviants, these intellectual innovators, these people thinking outside the box, the persecution slowly fades. And by the 18th century, it's still there, but it's little more than window dressing. Nobody gets burned alive. A few books get burned, but they could print new ones. I think the reason is not so much because rulers become more tolerant. Some did, some didn't, or enlightened, but basically because it was pointless. It was hopeless. And so the net result is, of course, a vibrant and lively market for ideas. And I think that is what's behind this. All right. Now I'm going to come to the second part and talk about aptitudes. And so what constrains the effectiveness of new ideas? And as I said, this is an age full of new ideas, but not all new ideas. In fact, most new ideas, I say, could not be realized even if they were in principle sound. The most famous example of this is, of course, Leonardo, who drew hundreds of pictures of these technological ideas, many of which were totally sound, but none of them could be built at the time. Leonardo is only the tip of the iceberg. There are lots of people like him, less famous, like Ramelli and so on and so forth. And they all had these technological ideas, but very few of them were realized or scaled up, if we say. So here are two examples that I'm particularly fond of. This here, you can see a painting. This is a submarine built in 1620 by the Dutch inventor Cornelis Drebbel. This is in London, by the way. He too moved from the Netherlands to London. And on the right, you see a first calculating machine. This is Blaise Pascal's mechanical calculator built 20 years later. Both of these things would have been extremely useful at the time if they could be built, but they couldn't. And so, you really have to wait until late in the 19th century until you see either submarines or mechanical calculators being turned into something that actually was of great use to society. And the answer is why not? And it has really very little to do with science. It's not because they didn't have electricity. The answer is, I think, workmanship and materials. And now both workmanship and materials are in some sense a form of knowledge, mostly tacit knowledge, but knowledge all the same, or what I call competence, okay? And so I would summarize these as aptitudes, and I'm going to say something about it. If you compare this sort of aptitude, these artisanal skills, and you compare Europe and the rest of the world, I would say, and I really cannot test this in a rigorous way, but it's sort of a strong impression that if you look at the world in, say, 1400, compared to Europe, both the Chinese and Middle Eastern societies, and probably India as well, have superior technological abilities in shipbuilding, navigation, metallurgy, hydraulics, textiles, printing, weapons, and engineering. But you can sort of see that the Europeans are slowly closing the gap. So 200 years later, when the first Jesuits arrive in China in 1582, they already start writing down in certain areas in which China is backward. You read the writings of Matteo Ricci, one of the first Jesuits who arrived to China. And what they observe is that many of the skills that the Chinese used to have, and the Song and Yuan dynasties, had actually deteriorated or even were lost. Okay, two examples are clockmaking and shipbuilding. But that said, I would still say that if you look at 1550 or thereabout, Asia still has a very large, highly skilled class of artisans who produce many of the luxury goods, including, of course, porcelains, high-end textiles, and on and on and on, which the Europeans sailed all the way around Africa to put in their little ships and ship them back to Europe and sell them at a huge profit. So obviously this was something that Europeans really wanted but couldn't make themselves. And that, I think, is telling. Now, by 1700 or so, European artisans were very quickly improving. I think this is particularly true in Britain. That's, of course, no coincidence, where we see more and more evidence of artisans making high-quality clocks and watches, telescopes, instruments, pumps, and, of course, after 1712, steam engines, and on and on and on. but on the continent too. It's not just British. Okay, here are two examples of really clever things that the Europeans made in the middle of the 18th century. This here is, of course, Vaucanson's famous duck, which could actually walk and quack and defecate, a very wonderful machine. And this, of course, is, I don't have to tell you, this is the Cremona Violin Museum, which I visited 2 years ago to buy other stuff. I mean, these are marvels of brilliant artisanship. When people could make these violins, really were unbelievably skilled. Now, what mattered here, and this is something I have been pushing for the last decade or so, it isn't so much the average ability of European artisans. It really is the people who are the most skilled and dexterous of them, okay? The Stradivari and Guarneri of this world. So this is an example of the critical role of what I call upper tail human capital, or UTHC, which is become something in the literature, which disproportionately, I think, drives technological change and productivity growth. And so people at the time, of course, realized this. So, Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations make this point. He says that to think or to reason comes to be, like every other employment, a particular business, which is carried on by very few people who furnish the public with all the thought and reason possessed by the vast multitude of that labor. And so the benefit of the speculations of the philosopher, when he says philosopher, he really means scientist, it may evidently descend to the meanest of people if they led to improvements in the mechanical art. And so here's a quote from D'Alembert, who, of course, was the editor of the Grande Encyclopédie, who wrote in 1751 that among artists, hardly a dozen in 1,000, okay, could explain themselves about the tools that they use and the goods that they produce. And so, if you look at who are these artisans that Adam Smith and D'Alembert and others are talking about, these are clockmakers, watchmakers, instrument makers, engineers, millwrights, musical instrument makers, that kind of people. And so that, I think, is a critical element in explaining the timing and location of the Industrial Revolution. And so I'm going to be now exposing you to a poem I wrote. This is the last poem I promised to write in this lifetime, but this is a poem I'm very proud of. And the poem answers the following question: why did none of Leonardo's invention ever become a reality, but James Watt's did? And here's the poem. The poem is that the difference between Leonardo and Watt was that Watt had Wilkinson and Leonardo did not. So who, you may well ask, who was Wilkinson? Well, there you have Wilkinson. This is John Wilkinson, who's an iron master. These are obviously in his Sunday clothes because he's being sitting for a famous painter at the time, Gainsborough. But John Wilkinson, of course, was the man who could bore the cylinders at a level of accuracy and precision that made it possible for James Watt's engines to work. So he was clearly the most skilled iron master of his time. And in that sense, he is sort of a pars pro toto for the kind of people that the Industrial Revolution needed. So here, there's a fair amount of research being done on this in recent years. And we can see the progress in artisanal skills in Europe at that time. Okay, so there's a paper by two of my friends and co-authors, Morgan Kelly and Cormac O'Grada, who showed that the real price of watches in England fell by about 1.3% a year for over a century, the result of increasingly fine division of labor, learning by doing, so minor inventions that make these artisanals better. The same is true for, say, something like small arms. So Philip Hoffman has shown the decline in prices of firearms due to the growth of total factor productivity. And for a little bit earlier period, he shows that the total, that the price of these guns is going down over time. And of course, this is an underestimate. Both of them are underestimated because they don't fully account for improvements in quality of products. Okay. Now, I would say that in the absence of really major breakthroughs, what I call macro inventions, this sort of technological advances through artisans would have run eventually into diminishing returns. And so I would think that the formal knowledge from natural philosophy and practical mathematics is complementary to those tacit skills, the best craftsmen and engineers. But to make major breakthroughs, I think one needed increasingly science. So the evolution of modern chemistry after Lavoisier in the 1780s, or the evolution of modern electricity in the 19th century, those are things that you are not going to reach unless you have the science underlying it. That's all I'm going to say. What I do want to add is that it isn't just competence, it's materials. And in a way, you know, if you want, materials is form of mechanical competence. One good example of that is the perfection of the so-called crucible process in 1740. This is by a Sheffield, a clockmaker, by the way, Benjamin Huntsman. So it produced not just a much more homogeneous product, which is very important in steel, but also removed various impurities because of better temperature control. I'm not going to get into the details here. But steel really is critical, and it's been overlooked by most historians. But of course, if you're going to produce machine parts and cutting tools and springs and anything else that needs a material that's resilient and durable, that's what you need. And I'm glad to say that the one intellectual who pointed this out, of all people, is Friedrich Engels. In the condition of the working class in England, in which he makes this statement, in which he attributes much of industrial might to the evolution of steel. And so I think what is the key then to Europe's success is, to some extent, the notion that artisans and scientists should talk to each other and cooperate, okay? And that science and math are supposed to serve practical purposes, okay? So Newton himself, who hardly was much of an engineer or a technologist, but he basically says that geometry, by which he means really mathematics, was devised not for the purpose of bare speculation, but for workaday use. And of course, once calculus, that he himself helped to invent, came online, it was found to be useful in many applications. And so this is something that I have called, and I've been pushing this concept for many years now, called the Industrial Enlightenment. And what I'm really talking about is that scientists were themselves interested in practical problems, and in many cases had no qualms in getting dirt under their fingernails. So these are not ivory tower intellectuals, but there were people who were really interested in practical problems. So there's this complementarity between the savant, the people who know things, and the fabricant, people who make things. And of course, sometimes they are the same person. Here you got Joseph Priestley, inventor of discovery of oxygen in 1774, but he also invented carbonated water and the pencil eraser. So clearly these are very mundane things, but things that matter. My favorite example is this man, not a household name anymore, but in his time he was very famous. This is René Réaumur. There you have his picture. He's trained as a mathematician, and he was sort of a leading lifelong member of the French Académie Royale. But you look at his writings, and he is writing about all these practical issues. You know, what is steel really? I mean, he's the first to suggest in his own sort of weird language the properties of steel. He wrote about porcelain. He wrote about egg incubation, about entomology, about glass fibers. He suggested the possibility of making paper from wood, and you know, on and on and on. So this is a leading intellectual who's deeply immersed in practical problems. Now, in Britain, more than anywhere else, perhaps, this sort of connection between scientists and industrialists is socially ingrained. So this is, of course, you've all heard of this. This is the Lunar Society of Birmingham. These are the guys sitting around. I mean, the guy with the brown yarmulke, I think, is Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin. And you see James Watt here and a few others. It's really wonderful. And so, just to summarize, it's a combination of attitude and aptitude that's driving it. And the genius of the Industrial Enlightenment was not just that people believed in progress, but that they actually suggested a way in which it was to be achieved, and then went ahead and carried it out. And I think the improvement in the institutions that form the environment to this is critical to what happened between 1760 and 1830 and the rise of European. So now I'm reaching the end of this story, but this is the question you've all been waiting for, and that's about the past. You know? What about the future? Can progress continue? And I'm going to give you a bit of a mixed message here, okay? There are clouds on the horizon. Is the future of progress assured? And I think in terms of our ability and willingness and needs to develop new technologies, the answer is almost surely yes. I mean, we need new technology, not just because when I first wrote this, I didn't know about COVID, but clearly to solve medical problems that have come to the horizon. But there's big other issues that we have to deal with, of course, including environmental issues and on and on and on and on. But, and I haven't really said much about this, that will be a different lecture. Progress also depends on the right institutional and political environment. And here, I think there is much less of a reason to be optimistic. There is no guarantee that these will continue to progress. And in fact, there's some reason that they may be regressing. So the institutional features that we need for progress are well known. Here's a list of mine. Anybody can add or subtract to that. This is something that almost everybody has thought about. You know, things like economic liberty and mobility are very important. The rule of law, low rent seeking and corruption, free and open press, human rights, you know, all these things matter. And if you don't have them, then maybe all of those things that I've been talking about will come to naught. And I think the great danger that the world is facing today is not, as my learned colleague Bob Gordon seems to think, that all the good ideas have already been discovered and, you know, everything that can be invented has been invented. That's not it. What is a concern is what I call unbalanced growth, but not in the usual sense in which we use unbalanced growth, but continued expansion of useful knowledge that is not accompanied by institutional progress. And these could create unprecedented hazards to humanity. You know, one of those, of course, are nuclear weapons, but there are many others. And it's for good reason that economic historians routinely speak about technological progress, but of institutional change. And I think there's good reason for that. There is no strong evidence that institutions follow any kind of trend toward improvement in history. And I think the last few decades, most measures of institutional quality, from human rights to the freedom of the press, constraints on the executives, blah, 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 all the things that political science and the World Bank are using, have shown, if anything, a decline. And that, of course, is extremely worrisome. And so I'll end by a quote, which I have used many, many times, which will stand as the understatement, not of the century, but maybe of the millennium. This comes out of the last paragraph of Sigmund Freud's The Future of an Illusion. And Freud says, while mankind has made continual advances in its control over nature, this was written a century ago, by the way, and may be expected to make still greater ones, it is not possible to establish with certainty that a similar advance had been made in the management of human affairs. And I'm afraid these words of wisdom still hold today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joel. And I must say that I think we should really put your three attitudes as our new motto: skepticism, openness, and neophilia. I really like that, and I really would be extremely happy if we could pursue this. Now, the floor is now open for questions. I see already one question there, but just to warm up a little bit, I'm going to ask you a specific question. Everything starts, I mean, in your story, in around 1450, right? And that is the time of Renaissance, okay, where we, the humankind and Europeans achieve incredible heights, especially in the arts, no, in the arts, architecture, etc. Why and how they managed to get that extraordinary level of excellence at that time on those specific, in those specific fields? I mean, and do you think that those were really the roots for the subsequent development of European culture?
I think so. I mean, I think, you know, why it all started in around 1450 is, of course, a difficult question. And I must say that a lot of medievalists who will get very angry at me because they will argue that, in fact, there are far more successful, thoughtful scientists in the Middle Ages than we think. And then the notion that we should think of the Middle Ages as sort of a dark age clearly is, nobody really holds it. There were major technological advances in the Middle Ages, including, of course, the invention of clocks, the adoption of windmills. You know, I could go on and on. It's in much of that's in my book. But I think 1450, or the period between 1450 and 1500, is critical for a variety of reasons. Certainly, one of those is the invention of the printing press, as in my column, Jeremiah Dittmar has argued at great length. And before him, of course, Elizabeth Eisenstein. I think the great voyages, which was something that really nobody expected and nobody anticipated, made a big difference in many dimensions. But I also think that the successful fragmentation of Europe into these competing political units really comes into its own after the Black Death, with the rise of much more powerful political units, which we call states, which very consciously and explicitly compete with one another and won't let other units get ahead. So there's a whole bunch of things coming together. This final element to this, and you know, this is a central part of my 2016 book, is that what you see in Europe from the maybe late 15th century on, is that in some ways they have the best of all possible world in the following sense. It's a highly competitive region of the world in which cities and, as I said, universities and states and religions, everybody compete with one another. But it has an intellectual unity. And that means that you can exploit economies of scale, because it doesn't make sense to write a major book describing the circulation of blood or the movement of the planets if only the people in your village are going to read it. You're writing it for a larger audience. And what we see happening in Europe is, of course, the emergence of the Respublica Literaria, the Republic of Letters, in which if a book is published in London, it will be read a month later in Edinburgh, and 2 months later in Amsterdam, and 3 months later in Krakow, and in Stockholm, and with a little bit of luck, even in St. Petersburg, maybe just later. But you know what I'm saying? It's spreading throughout Europe, because the Europeans developed this transnational intellectual community that allows a single set of intellectuals to communicate with each other, regardless of where they were coming from. So the impact of somebody like Descartes or Newton or Galileo or any of these lesser names, these were truly European-wide reputations. These were not just reputations in their own country. And that makes, I think, for a huge difference, because in some sense, this is, of course, now it's very important to emphasize, Giorgio, that this is not a plan. This is not a design. This is what we call an emergent property, right? This is something that comes out of lower level interactions that create something much bigger that nobody had counted on. But by 1600, I would say, maybe before, this is in place. And you can sort of see this continent-wide movement toward intellectual innovation. There's a division of labor there. You know, the French are good at one thing, the Germans in another, the Dutch in a third, the Italians in another. So there's some division of labor, but when something major is invented in one country, it spreads everywhere, and it changes people's curriculum, you know, and you can sort of see this because you can see where these people study, you know. So somebody like Vesalius, you know, who basically founded modern anatomy, Belgian, but he studied in Padova. And people move around the continent, and even if they don't move, their books move, their letters move, and so you get this institution, which is not a political institution, but it is an intellectual institution. And you know, I should say, we still have it. I mean, we don't call it the Republic of Letters, but we still have it. You know, if a major economist writes a paper that makes a big difference, okay, it's read everywhere. It isn't just read in the United States or in Britain or in Italy. And so that, I think, transnational nature of knowledge, it becomes much more pronounced in Europe in the 16th and 17th century, in part because of the printing press, in part because of something that almost gets no press at all, but which is really important, which is better postal services, right? So they didn't have the internet, but they could send letters. So things like that, I think, really matter.
Thank you very much. I think that also the internet favors the Republic of Letters, and I think that this lecture is an example of it. You got several questions. Mr. Yongseok Shin is thanking you for the great lecture, and says that in the attitude part, you mentioned the polycentric nature of Europe, which is related also to what you were mentioning about the diffusion of ideas in Europe. So was this unique to Europe? If so, what is the fundamental reasons for this polycentricity? Does geography a part of the explanation?
This is a very good question, and there is some recent work on this, trying to explain why Europe is, split into all these sort of small and medium-sized political entities, whereas China, you know, at least from about the 12th century on, is a single unit, and so is most of the sort of Ottoman Empire dominating the Middle East. I would say to some extent, this may well be an accident, that one can imagine a time and a world in which China would have been divided into warring kingdoms. In fact, we know there were eras of warring kingdoms. So had China remained, I think, a more polycentric political entity, its history may have been very different. Whether the reason that Europe is polycentric or not, it has something to do with geography. And there is I refer people to the recent book by Walter Scheidel, which is actually published in my series at Princeton University Press. And Walter really goes deeply into this, and it's actually sort of has complicated factors of military technology and geography, and the importance of a steppe where, you know, people can ride and threaten China. I won't get into detail, but obviously geography had something to do with it. But I think it's also to some extent an accident. One can well imagine a world in which somebody like, you know, Charles V or Charlemagne or Napoleon or somebody else would have succeeded in combining, or Hitler, for God forbid, combining the entire continent into a single unit and eventually eliminate this polycentricity. So there are times when these sort of accidental factors do play an important role. That said, I must say the question is very much to the point, and this is actually a subject of quite a bit of interesting literature in recent years, simply because people have come to realize how important this polycentricity is. That said, I must admit, this idea is not original with me, nor original with any of my fellow economic historian. You can actually find this idea in David Hume in the 18th century. And in fact, the more you read David Hume, the more you realize that most good ideas in economics today can be found in David Hume. So So Hume wrote about it, and so in a somewhat different way did Immanuel Kant and others. So this idea was around during the Enlightenment thinkers because it's kind of obvious if you think about it.
Yes, we have another perspective on Europe, and the idea is that essentially there are some theories that suggest that Europeans have dominated because of culture, but also the advantage of a dense continent with natural resources needed for early civilizations: horses, cattle, and forests. Okay, and these perhaps were not so much available in other parts of the world. What do you think about this? So the geographic and the natural resources characteristics of Europe, how important they were?
People have looked at that at great length, and it really flies into the face of the fact that if you look at Song China, then, in terms of things like iron and coal, which are sort of two of the main resources that people talk about, or their ability to feed a large population through fertile soil, that there is, very little to say about Europe that's more, that it has the resources. As far as resources are concerned, geography, in my view, always plays second fiddle to knowledge. For instance, I'll give you an example. So people say that England was the first to have an industrial revolution because it had all this coal. And, it is true. There's a lot of coal in England, and they used it heavily in the 18th and even more so in the 19th century. Some may say, we wish they hadn't, but they did. But remember, the coal has been there for 10 million years. When Julius Caesar came to England, the coal was there, but he didn't do anything with it because they did not have the knowledge to find it, to extract it, to transport it, and to utilize it. That takes technology, that takes knowledge. And if you have the resources without the technology, it does you no good. Now, suppose you have the technology and you don't have the resources. Does that doom you? And the answer is no. The country that was perhaps for a while the most successful technologically and economically was the Low Countries, where I was born. There's no coal, there's no iron. Most of what there is water, which they're trying to get rid of. And they did. They developed, they become the leaders of hydraulic technology in Europe, and much of the land that they actually live on is beneath sea level, but the technology will allow you to do that. The other example you can give is places like Switzerland and Japan and other places. They have very few resources, certainly compared to others, but they can substitute around it. And if they can substitute around it, they import them. Remember, as I keep telling my students, okay, the one industry that grew faster than any other industry during the British Industrial Revolution is cotton. And as I said, cotton grows nowhere in Europe. So it didn't stop them. They went to North America and they grew it. And they brought it in, and they brought in some more, and then they brought in these huge quantities. It changed the history of the United States. But that's what ingenuity will do. If you don't have it, you find it. And if you can't find it, you substitute around it. That's, I think, the key to their success. So I am not a big resources determine everything. I know people disagree with me on that, and basically they will blame, particularly in people who write about Africa, like Jeffrey Sachs, for instance, thinks that tropical climates and so on and so forth are devastating. I have never really been convinced about that. I think our ability to manipulate the physical environment is exactly what technology does, and it's always been like that.
But scarcity make men ingenious, but not always. That's the story. Professor Diego Gambetta has an interesting question for you. How relevant was the experimental logic that Francis Bacon introduced in the development process that you described?
Well, it's of course very important. And there are lots of books written about it's the experimental method. Now, it has to be said that particularly the Greeks didn't have much time for experiments, even though there's some evidence they did conduct experiments because it's sort of obvious. But clearly, if you look at medieval science, experiments are fairly rare. And I think what you see happening in the 16th century, and then it's formalized by Bacon, but in fact it's already there, and people like Paracelsus and others, carry out all kind of experiments in the Low Countries, Van Helmont, people like that. So, I mean, and clearly if you look at the progress in the 18th century, experiments become incredibly important. Okay, so you get, on the one hand, you get people assembling facts, people like Linnaeus, say, who basically just collect and catalog facts, but you need people carrying out experiment, and particularly in the evolution of modern chemistry. I mean, it's unimaginable that somebody like Lavoisier or Cavendish could have done their work without careful experimentation. In fact, much of what's happening in the scientific enlightenment is making experiments more rigorous and making sure that when you do an experiment, okay, you describe materials and methods very carefully so that it can be replicated, because the essence of the experimental method is replication, right? I mean, I want to make sure you did it right. I replicated it. If there's anything that will doom a scientist's career is come up with a paper that is not reproducible.
That's possible. Okay, just last questions. I combined two questions, and it's more about the future and your mix of ideas between institution on the one hand and polycentricity on the other. So one bit is about inequalities, and how far do you think that the growth in inequalities, partly related also to the process of globalization, can be an obstacle to economic growth and your idea of progress, if you want, and development of new institutions, etc. And the other idea, the other question, which is partly related, is the fact that if you want, we have in a way inverted the copy machines, or the direction of copying, in the idea that or at least there are ups and downs, in the sense that it's no longer the European that are copying from the Chinese, but for a while there has been the Chinese copying back from the Europeans, and now maybe, especially in IT, we are copying back from the Chinese. So what do you see? So these two ideas which are interesting, one the idea of inequality, another the global flows of ideas and imitations.
Well, these are two separate questions, and they're both very important, and I could spend the next 2 hours talking about them.
I had no doubt about it.
Inequality worries me a great deal, in part because I think that it's absurd, that we have a top 0.1% in the United States who are making far more money than they can ever hope to spend in a lifetime, and whereas we have at the same time people, certainly now in this day and age, who just don't know how they're going to get food on the table. And I think in a civilized society doesn't tolerate that. And particularly if they can afford to not tolerate it, and we can. So that it worries me a great deal. It worries me even more because I think growing inequality has the potential of leading to political instability and to the institutional weakening. So yeah, I worry about inequality. I also worry, however, that much of the literature on inequality has been very imprecise. And it's been imprecise for a variety of reasons. The first is that inequality of income and inequality of wealth are often mixed together, and they're very different from each other, of course. And then when you're looking about inequality of wealth, you have to worry about inequality in human capital, which tends to be much lower than inequality in physical capital. But what matters more than anything else is perhaps inequality of access to resources. And then you really have to start worrying about things like public goods, where everybody has access. And so in some sense, there is no inequality in public good, at least as a first approximation. And so that, I think, worries me, that when we're dealing with inequality, I mean, particularly in the popular press, not so much in the writings of, say, Piketty and Zuckman and people like that, but in the popular press, people are obviously confound different concepts of inequality. About, the technological leadership, which you really asked me about, this is what, so Europe, the West, really, I should say, Europe and the Western world has been a technological leader for a long time. But I actually, in my younger days, wrote a bunch of papers in which I argued that no technological leader stays in that position for very long, and that one of the great merits of a global economy is that if there is a slowdown in technological progress in one part of the world, it will shift somewhere else. But the fruits, the benefits, will accrue to everybody. And so you look and say, a good example is, say, the history of the Netherlands. So the Netherlands are the world's technological leader in the 16th and first half of the 17th century, not just in commerce and finance, but in manufacturing, shipbuilding, food processing, you name it. And then by the 18th century, they're losing that position to other countries, first Britain and then Belgium and France and so on. So by 1870, 1880, the Netherlands really has become a follower. And, this is probably not good for the national pride, but the living standards in the Netherlands were rising just as fast as everybody else because, they say, oh my God, we can do this too. And they imitated and they did fine. So I would not be concerned. Being an economist, I'm mostly interested in living standards. And if the technological innovations come this decade from China and maybe in 2 decades from India, they're already coming from India, and maybe in 50 years from Africa, that's fine. That's fine. As long as it's happening somewhere in the world, it's happening everywhere. And where precisely it's taking place, I don't know. Now, having said that, I used to be very bullish on Chinese progress. Looking at what's happening in China today, I'm less sure because, as I said, what progress really requires is the level of intellectual pluralism and toleration for dissent and people who think outside the box. And I see there's some signs that that's declining in China under the current regime. And if that's pushed further, then I would worry, and I would worry that they would end up a little bit like what happened in the Soviet Union, which is that because of the very strongly conformist forces that made dissent in many ways to be unacceptable, the country fell behind technologically. And that, I think, I'm not saying it's happening in China now, but this is a danger that they have to worry about. And I would hope that in the United States, whatever happens here, that this kind of First Amendment mentality in which you can say whatever you want, and then the market for idea will judge you, but we're not going to put you in jail or prosecute you for saying something the government doesn't like, that we haven't reached that point. There are some worrisome signs on the horizon under the current regime, but I think it's too early to tell.
Thank you very much, Joel. This was really a great lecture. I think we really have exhausted you and your time.
No.
We had also, I realized we had you to lecture over your lunchtime. So this was really cruel on our behalf. And I think we really learned a lot about the emergence of the modern economy, and also what was very important and also connected to how we opened this lecture with the said a moment of silence with Samuel Paty on how essentially the freedom of idea is really, and the freedom of idea and the freedom of thought is really at the heart of modern growth and modern society. So really, thank you very much. Thank you, Aldo, for your very nice introduction. And I really hope that we will be able to host Joel in our wonderful premises in Torino and take you around and discuss more and more about the sources of modern growth and modernity. Thank you very much, Joel. A great
And stay healthy and safe, everybody.
Yes, and you too, eh?
Bye.
Bye, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Aldo.